Hello and welcome to another episode of Anomalies. This is a program about what happens when you're going down what you think is a straight and narrow path, and then you decide to take a interesting diversion off to another path. And tonight we're going to be doing that with our special guest, Jason Valenti. And I've known Jason for quite some time here. He did a course. Jeff Pratt and I did a cryptozoology class, and Jason was part of that, and he is a Bigfoot, not only Bigfoot enthusiast, but a Bigfoot experiencer. So he's going to be on with us tonight. We're very excited about that. Dave Jinks, our other host, is having some technical difficulties, but he's trying to go ahead and connect with us. So hopefully he'll be able to join us. Um, so, Jason, where do you want to start? Do you want to start with your experience, or I know
Yeah,
you've got some.
yeah, I
Yeah,
probably
go
would.
ahead.
We'll start with that.
Yeah, because that was very interesting.
Sure. So before we get into that, what I like to, I think it's important when you're first getting into this field, and because there's a lot of mystery surrounding the field of Sasquatch, Bigfoot, whatever you want to call it, and when you get into it, you wind up with more questions than you do answers. That's typically what most people experience. So, the goal is to actually ask the right questions, to help people formulate probably what they should be looking for, especially if they're really interested in the research and they want to go out and try to find it or learn more about the history of it and stuff like that. And my
Sounds like a
qualifications are
good
nothing
approach.
more. Pardon?
Sounds like a good approach.
Yeah, I think so. So my qualifications are just that I'm curious and I have an investigative mind. I don't have a PhD in anything. It just my own personal experience just made me uh, get pretty obsessed with the topic, and so I, devoured lots of books and watched a lot of videos and talked to a lot of people. So, my background is that I had about a year and a half seminary. Was really interested in prophecy and eschatology. Jack of all trades, master of none. I've persistently been in this field for almost 29 years now, and I believe that I know how to ask the right questions when it comes to this. At least it naturally came to me, I think, because of the way I grew up, with an engineering background, um, and being interested in religion and stuff like that, philosophy of existence, stuff like that. So this is the very first slide that I had that you saw was Paul Smith's digital artwork. This is as well, and I met Paul in 2003, and we just hit it off. He was excited that I had been an eyewitness, and so we talked for about almost 7 years before he was able to come up with. Actually, may have even been longer than that. But every time we would get together, which was infrequent, but he would ask me more questions about the details of what my sighting was. And so he finally came up with this rendition, and I would say that this slide is pretty accurate for what I saw, with the exception of the breasts with nipples. I never
Hmm.
said that I saw nipples, but and I couldn't clearly see the outline of breasts either. I just know that she had a very feminine figure. She had very wide hips, small waist, more slender build. I would say that she was svelte. Even though when you're looking at this photo, um, he tried to make her legs look pretty slender, but she just had extraordinarily wide hips, and it was like when I first saw her, it was almost like a kangaroo kind of
Hmm.
bottom, you know, um, knock-kneed, like her legs were very knock-kneed looking, and that was accentuated by her gait because as we were coming towards her in the car, it was about 4 o'clock in the morning, and we were just south of Tallahassee in Apalachicola National Forest. And so when we were approaching her in my truck, I was driving a Toyota truck. It was not jacked up. It was like one of those regular sized Toyota SR5s, 1986, and had a topper on the back. That's an important detail. Um, so as we were approaching her, she was squatting behind a tree that had fallen through the forest. And so, as you can imagine, looking at this image, there was a tree pretty far back in the forest that had fall like perpendicular to the road, and the tip of it was almost up to the road. So she was squatting behind it, and Dennis, the guy that was with me when this occurred, we both thought that she was probably ripping apart a bird's nest, because when I
Hmm.
first noticed that there was something up ahead at about 100 yards, and we were traveling about 50 miles an hour. This is like some country road that connected uh, Tallahassee to, I think it was US 19. I think that's the road. But I might even have a map of it here. Yeah.
So were you weren't out there looking for
No,
this creature?
I wasn't interested in this topic at all. As a matter of
Hmm.
fact, if you can see down in Florida where there's Clearwater, Tampa, that little blue,
Uh-huh.
that's
Yeah.
where I was from. We traveled to
Uh-huh.
the yellow up where Pensacola is. We had to make that whole drive. It took like 8 hours one way. And so we were doing network marketing. Equinox, that was a real popular network marketing company back in the 80s, 90s, mid 90s. And so we left at midnight, left Pensacola, came to Tallahassee. So we were just trying to, I did, the green lines are the interstate. So we were trying to jump from the interstate to this road that hugged the Gulf Coast going all the way
Okay.
down Tampa. And but I had botched up the instructions from, I think we talked to a police officer at like a convenient mart, and this is before phones, before you had maps. And so he was just like, "Oh yeah, go here, turn right, go around the construction zone." And the construction zone totally threw me off because of the way it was laid out. So I wound up taking a road that just bordered Apalachicola National Forest when we were supposed to be heading east. So we kind of went southwest. So, and I didn't know that we were on the wrong road until we were like
Hmm.
practically to the road that we were supposed to be on, because we just had to go a lot further in the wrong direction to get to it. So about 15 minutes into the drive, that's when I noticed that the radio stations were blinking out. And so when I reached down to turn off the radio, and right when I looked back up, I noticed really far down the road that there was something. And my first impression was is that it was an Irish setter, like chasing its
Hmm.
tail. It was like this flurry of hair just like flying around uh, in a very small space. And as I got closer, I was like, wow, that's really strange. And then I looked down at my dashboard, noticed that my brights were not on, flashed the brights on, and then that's when those glowing eyes appeared at the top of this whirling mass of hair. It was about 3 feet off, 3 or 4 feet off the ground. And then in the next moment, it just all the hair stopped and fell straight down, and then it stood up. She just unfolded from this, like it's almost like she was squatting, like as if her
Hmm.
sits bones, like her butt was on the ground and her knees were like on the sides of her shoulders, and she was reaching in between her legs. We think she was tearing apart a bird's nest. And
You
so,
said you saw some eye shine. What
oh
what
yeah,
color
yeah, it
were the
was.
eye? What
Here's
color
what's
were the eye?
the eye shine's really interesting because I saw orange and Dennis saw green.
Oh, that is
That's the way,
interesting.
and I had an experience years later because that always puzzled me. That was the only discrepancy when I think about the way we tell our stories, minus except for, he saw that whole thing that I'm going to get into here in a few minutes. But when we characterize her, his perception was is that her hair was a little darker than blonde. And I was like, no, she was blonde, white skinned
Hmm.
and blonde, blonde. He's like, no, it was more like a light brown. So I don't know, you know. But he saw green eyes and I saw orange eyes. And I was at a party one time looking at a dog in the backyard at about 30 or 40 feet away. And the dog was looking at us, and there was a person sitting next to me. And right when it turned its head, its eyes went from green to orange right
Wow.
there. And I was like, oh my God, that's what we saw. It was probably the rods and cones, the way it was reflecting. And it just was the right angle, for him to see something different than me.
Hmm. Interesting. Okay.
But, yeah, so and the eye sockets were really big. I remember it looked like she had abnormally big eyes. Well, I mean, compared to a human. Um, but yeah, definitely had a brow ridge. Of course, I saw all these features up close, because if the window would have been rolled down on Dennis's side of the vehicle, Dennis could have grabbed her right arm.
Hmm.
And so as we were approaching her, she stands up, she starts walking slash stumbling backwards, because the other thing I noticed about her gait is that her lower leg swung outward as it was going backwards. As she was walking backwards, it's like her leg would swing out like this.
Hmm.
It was, and I didn't know that that gait was normal for a hominoid, because that's what I call them, is a hominoid, like everything that we see in the pre-humans, or what scientists call pre-humans. But when you look at the Patterson Gimlin film, and especially when you look at the superpositioning that Ruben Steindorf did in Sasquatch Legend Meets Science, when you see that piece of footage, that is exactly the way she's walking in
She was
forward.
walking.
Yeah,
Okay.
Patty walks like that, exactly like that. And so I saw that in reverse in my eyewitness account. So, but it was just it was weird to see it for the first time, and I didn't know that these creatures were real. It's like I couldn't have been
Right.
less interested, and I didn't even know what they were called.
Mm.
And
Did
so,
you have a sense of how big or how
yeah, oh
tall?
yeah, yeah, yeah. She was about 7 feet, give or take
Okay.
a couple inches. Yeah, about 7 feet.
Okay.
I remember her hip was real close to the door jamb, because I'm driving with my hands on the steering wheel, and as I turned my head to look at her, I lost sight of her at the door jamb, just past Dennis's head.
Mm.
And I remember her hip was pretty close to the top of the door jamb. Now, mind you, we're not in one of those tall trucks. It was just like those
Right.
small Toyota SR5 extra cab trucks. So yeah, so she was fairly tall. I would say she was as tall as the Patterson Gimlin subject. She just had a different build. She was more, she just was thinner. She was more
Hmm.
svelte. She didn't have that linebacker look. She looked more like a well-muscled basketball player like Michael Jordan. That's kind of
Okay.
the way that I would characterize her build, but very wide shoulders nonetheless. That's what was impressive to me. Her shoulders were just so wide. It was just like, wow.
Hmm.
And her hips were nearly as wide, and she kind of had an hourglass figure. And when her hands were up in front of her face, I just remember that they looked so human, and that was disturbing. I was like, why do those hands look so human? And people have asked me, it's like, well, how far was the thumb down on the hand? Because the great apes have these like tiny thumbs and stuff like that. Well, we do also have hand skeletons of the Neanderthals, and their hands are kind of built like that. They have these smaller thumbs, and the distance in between the crotch where the thumb is and the forefinger, it's actually longer on the pre-humans. So, but I can't tell you that I saw that. I just remember seeing these gigantic hands in front of her face, and she's trying to, block my headlights, because she
Hmm.
she had that look. She had an expression on her face, was like, "Oh shit, this thing's going to hit me." Because yeah, as she's stumbling backwards, her right foot is almost touching the asphalt of the road, and it probably did a couple times as she was stumbling backwards. So, white skin. It wasn't her hair. The hair that covered her body was not fur. It was like matted hair, and it
Hmm.
was, I would, not that it was sparse, but it was not densely populated hair either. It was more of a kind of like what you see with chimpanzees. It was
Hmm.
very characteristic of a chimpanzee, not like a gorilla. It was more like a chimpanzee. And
Some
so,
of the people that I've talked to who've had experiences with Sasquatch, and this might be different for you because you were in a car that was moving, but they have some kind of an emotional response to this. Did you, anything like that happen to you?
no,
Or
but no, and I think the reason why is because it was just so fast. I think
quick, yeah.
if we would have been hiking in the forest and rolled up on her, I think we probably would have had an emotional response. Or there could have been something like a telepathic connection, because that
Yeah,
seems to
okay.
be a very frequent piece of information that always surfaces in these eyewitness accounts when people are boots on the ground and they come across them.
Kind
Ours
of like
just,
a mind speak type of
yeah,
thing.
yeah, totally. But I think
Okay.
because I've thought about this. It's like, why did we catch her so surprised? Why did this happen? And the only thing I could think of is that the road that we were on, I think, was like had just been blacktopped, because I remember it was very smooth road, and I had just rebuilt the engine in my Toyota truck, and so it was running perfect. It was like a new truck. And I think because of the way we were traveling southwest, I think subconsciously, when her head was down and she was doing what she was doing, I think that she was subconsciously thinking that my headlights were the sun rising,
Hmm.
because it was like 4 a.m. So
Hmm.
maybe she would just, at the last minute, she just looked up and was like, "Hey, wait a minute, that's not the sun rising. What is that?" And the whole time we were on that road at this time of night, we never passed a car from Tallahassee
Wow.
to that junction. There was no cars behind us. We never passed a car in the oncoming lane. It was remote. This is 1996. so it's less populated in that area. If you look at the maps now, a lot of the neighborhoods that are around where my sighting was, they weren't there back then.
Mhm.
So, yeah.
What was the reaction of the person that was in your car with you, or the truck?
Well, we had very different reactions, and the
Hmm.
reason is that I think because I had lived a pretty sheltered life. I was raised very fundamentalist Christian. Thought the Earth was 6,000 years old, and
Mhm.
all this stuff that goes along with that. And so I had a very narrow worldview. And the first thing that popped in my head was, oh my God, did I just see the missing link? And so
Uh-huh.
questions, immediate questions. And I just wanted to take a second look at this. I was like, is this really happening? And I was pushing hard on the brake to come to a complete stop. I was putting it in neutral. I was I was pulling the emergency brake. I was opening up my door. I was taking off my seatbelt. I was doing all this stuff to get out of the truck because I wanted to see if I could see it again. Because I was like, oh my God, did we just see this? Dennis had just gotten out of the Gulf War.
Uh-huh.
He was in recon and he saw he was PTSD.
Mhm.
So when we passed the creature, he got to see something that I didn't witness in that moment, and that is that as his hands were on the window and he's looking back at her, I had my foot on the brake, as I was trying to get out of the car, and it was enough light that was illuminating the rear end of the vehicle. You could see for quite a distance from just the brake lights being on because this is the dead of night, and so he said that he saw her from a standing position. Right when we passed her, she drops her arms and then kind of brings them back up on the sides, for balance. And he said that she looked one way across the road as if to contemplate, should I jump across or should I just travel in this direction or should I stay on the same side of the road and just go back into the forest that I'm on? Which she ultimately chose. But the way that she took off was really impressive because she took her fists and as she's standing up and she threw them down with such force towards the ground that her whole body just he said it looked like she just bounced off the ground. She just did this
Wow.
like this compression punch, and as she was leaving the ground she was pivoting off of her left foot and landing in the forest about 30 feet away, and as she was landing in a stride, like
Wow.
full blown, like something that there's no way a human in a costume could do. And I know this because I've been in a Bigfoot costume to do for a commercial, which I'll play for you later in the presentation. But it was such an extraordinary feat of strength and speed that he said conservatively when he was watching her run away into the black of night, he said she had to have been moving at 35 miles an hour, but if somebody would have had a radar gun and clocked her doing 50 and told him that he would have believed it. He said the
Wow.
speed was unbelievable, how fast this two-legged whatever it was just cruising through this. Now, mind you, this is happening and you can't really tell, but if you look at the sides, like to the left, to the right of the creature in this image, um, in that forest all throughout these and they look like telephone poles, like the further you went into the forest everything just looked like telephone poles because the branches didn't start to like 20 feet off the ground, and
Mhm.
it's a sand pine forest. So down on the ground you have these like little stumps that are like 18 inches tall with these fronds splaying out of the top of them, and they're pretty close together, and she's navigating this like it's nothing. Like she's navigating like she sees clearly, cruising at 35 plus miles an hour, and she's not tripping, she's not falling, she's just like right through it like it's nothing. And so, he's witnessing this and he's like, "Oh my God." And he told me, he said, "Dude, if you would have gotten out of the car, if I wouldn't have pulled you back in and she would have gotten a hold of you, I don't you probably would have killed you."
Huh.
That's where his head went. I had no
Yeah.
fear. So, backing up to what you said, did I feel anything? Were there any emotions? No, it was like a drive-by experience. It was just like it all happened so fast in 7 to 10 seconds, which is why I wanted to get out of the car. I was like, I want to get a second look. Is this really happening? And because he witnessed this, I'm on my way trying to get out of the car. And I remember my left foot hit the pavement. I'm pulling myself out of the truck. And right when he was out of sight, he just turned this way and grabbed me and pulled me back into the car. And, so our faces like were almost touching. And I said, come on, man, let's go see this thing. And he goes, no, man, just drive.
Mhm.
And then after he said that, silence for 4 hours. Like we were in shock.
Really?
Yeah, we were just in total shock. We didn't even know what to
So
say.
are
We
we
didn't even talk.
talking?
We didn't even talk about it. We just sat there, and I just drove for 4 hours. Like, what the hell just happened? And I could, and from that moment forward, I just kept seeing that whole sequence,
Hmm.
that whole 7 to 10 second sequence. It just kept playing over and over in my head for about 2 weeks before it
So
even started.
we're not talking about missing time thing here, are
No,
we?
no, I don't think there was any missing time. I've had a couple different people ask me about missing time.
Uh,
And I remember looking at the clock and we had to get home to our families and all that stuff. So I don't think I experienced missing time. Some
mhm.
people told me that I probably did. I don't know. I don't think so, but I'm not saying it's not possible.
Right.
But
Did you tell anybody else? Did either of you tell anybody else about this
oh
event?
yeah, I showed up to work the next day and I just like I said, I couldn't shut it off. It just kept on playing. It didn't matter if I was sleeping, I would dream about it. I keep
Mm,
dreaming of seeing this over and over and over. And then I would be at work because we had a family business where we were repairing biomedical equipment. My brother Justin and I were fixing all this portable X-ray equipment for this company, a couple companies in the area, the Tampa Bay area. And so I just would be sitting there at my test bench working on stuff, and I would just start crying. And my
Hmm.
brother would be like, "Jay, what's wrong?"
What
And I'm
the
like,
hell's
"I
going on?
saw this thing, and it's really important." And he's like, "Well, what did you see?" And he just kept asking me over and over, and I would tell him the same thing. And then my dad would come into the shop, and he'd be like, "What's wrong with you?" And I would tell him, and he goes, "Oh my God, what are you talking about? Were you guys on drugs?" And that's what my dad's perception was, is that I was on
uh,
something. And I was like, "No, Dad, I don't do that stuff. I'm not interested in that stuff." But we saw this creature, and he really wrestled with it. He just could not wrap his mind around what happened to me,
mhm.
and it just kind of was in denial about it for years. So yeah, I mean, so for like a couple of weeks, it didn't. My mind couldn't calm down. It just was. I was really struggling. So
Yeah,
yeah,
I think that's an interesting. I belong to something called Opus. Are you familiar with that?
yeah, you told me about
Or-
that before. Yeah,
Yeah, okay, yeah. So the good thing about Opus is we exist so that other people who have strange experiences can have a place to come and share that. And we're not going, well, you're just crazy,
yeah.
because I think people need that opportunity to share those kinds of experiences. Anyway,
No, that's great. Yeah, I wish that there would have been something like that around,
right.
but I did have the opportunity to share my experience because I did go to church and I told the pastor, and they all thought that I just needed to have the devil cast out of me, and I said no, it has nothing to do with that. And I lost all my friends. I mean, it's like nobody. I became a social pariah. It's like nobody wanted. You're crazy. You think you saw Bigfoot? I was like, I don't know what it was. It was just a giant. It looked like it was part human and part ape. So
Yeah.
what was it? Why is this thing running around the woods of Florida?
I think the pastor's response and some of the other responses just seem to be kind of fit with that perception of their
Yeah,
perception of reality. Interesting. Keep
yeah,
going.
yeah. So ultimately, because this happened in Florida, I just wasn't really familiar with any community at all. And of course, this is happening around the same time that the whole skunk ape thing is happening in South Florida. But
Uh-huh.
I didn't really connect with that guy. His name was what was his name? Dave. I can't remember his last name, but I just didn't connect with it. I mean, I saw mine in North Florida, and I just skunk ape did not register in my head at all for that reason. But ultimately, I wound up feeling the pull to come up to the Pacific Northwest because I knew that it was more acceptable in the Pacific Northwest for people to talk about Sasquatch.
Right.
But but before I did that, I was blessed in the sense that I did have somebody to talk to, and ironically, one of my dad's best friends at the time um, had had the opportunity to travel with Zachariah Sitchin and
Oh
Lloyd
yeah.
Pye. So which I didn't know any of this. I didn't know, but I just knew that he had been talking to my dad about Bigfoot, UFOs, and aliens to the point where my dad was like really getting angry and upset because my dad was religious. And so he told Tom, stop talking to me about that kind of stuff and don't talk to my boys, because we had a family business and my dad hired Tom to come in and he did maintenance routines on our software systems and stuff like that. So who do you think I talked to?
Yeah.
After about 2 weeks, after about 2 weeks of struggling with this and having no emotional support, um, I mean, my brother could only go so far. Justin was very compassionate and he would listen to me and he would be like, bro, I don't know what to say. I don't know how to help you. I'm sorry that you had this experience and you don't know what to do. So I needed answers. It's like I got to find out what is this all about.
Mhm.
And so I called up my dad's friend because he was like the only person I could think of because dad had said that he's into this real paranormal stuff. And so I called Tom and I just asked him straight up, can I come over and talk to you? And he goes, well, your dad doesn't want you talking to me. I said, I don't care. I need to talk to somebody because I had this
Mhm.
experience a couple of weeks ago and I can't shake it. I can't stop thinking about it. And it's making me really emotionally unstable. And he reluctantly agreed to it. And so I come over to his house and I knock on the door. And it's funny because he opens the door and he's got the chain to the door and he's just looking at me through the chain. And I'm like, he's like, so what do you want? I just need to talk to somebody about this thing. And then he's like, well, what happened to you? So I'm standing there in the hallway of his apartment, and so I start describing this whole thing that I just did. The previous, however long we've been on the show so far. And his eyes are getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and he's looking. So he finally shuts the door, pulls the chain off, opens it wide
Yeah.
open, grabs my wrist. He says, "Get in here."
Uh-huh. Yeah.
So 8 hours this man is talking to me about all kinds of stuff, and he had top security clearance at Martin Marietta Nuclear Warhead Division in Pinellas Park, Florida. I didn't know I didn't know this side of Tom. I mean, he was a family friend. I just knew that he was real
Mhm.
smart. He was in the Mensa Society.
Oh yeah.
Conducted the Florida Philharmonic Orchestra at 17 years old. He was a musical genius.
Wow.
Tom was the kind of guy you could hand him a computer language, a book, like thicker than a Bible, and give it to him on Friday, and on Monday he would be programming in that language fluently.
Oh my gosh.
He was genius. He was absolutely brilliant, and so
And
I had some
he
respect for him.
he had never had a Sasquatch experience. He just was really open or not.
No,
Go ahead.
he didn't have a Sasquatch experience, but he by this time he had traveled with Lloyd Pye and Zachariah
Oh,
Sitchin to the
okay.
Machu Picchu tour that Sitchin had invited some people on, and it just so happens that Tom and Lloyd Pye were bunkmates during that trip. So Lloyd was telling Tom about the book he was writing, Everything You Know Is Wrong, Part One, Human Origins.
Hmm.
That whole trip. So, um, and I didn't know any of this. I just needed somebody to talk to, and that
Right.
was the only person in my sphere of influence that I even remotely knew that might be open to hearing what I had to say. And so when I told him, my story, he was like, "Oh my God, you saw a Sasquatch." And I was like, "What's a Sasquatch?" He goes, "A Bigfoot." And I was like, "What's a Bigfoot?" He goes, "A Yeti."
Yeah.
What's a Yeti? Tom, what are you talking about? I don't know any of these
Yeah.
names. And
Uh-huh.
so he laughed at me. He thought that was really funny. But yeah, I'm in Florida. It's like there wasn't a whole lot of talk about those creatures in Florida.
Right.
Like the whole Patterson Gimlin film was from Bluff Creek. That's the Pacific Northwest.
California. Yeah.
And if anybody even knew about it in my area where I grew up, they hardly even brought it up for conversation. It was just like some
Hmm.
crazy thing.
Hmm.
So, it was very healing for me to have that conversation with Tom.
I bet.
And
I
yeah, I
bet.
mean, I felt normal again somewhat. And he handed me some books, like The 12th Planet by Sitchin, and
Hmm.
which, was very fascinating to me because in the cuneiform, which is the Sumerian language, uh, the cylinder seals have stories of these creatures. There's like this whole thing that goes along with it. And so he gave me this book, and I got home like at 10 o'clock that night after listening to stuff for 8 hours from him. And because I was a theologian and I took Greek and Hebrew, and I could understand word mapping and how languages, idioms and metaphors, and how they evolve, and how when you translate you lose comprehension, and you get different meanings. So I followed what Sitchin was saying in the book, and it was like, so for the first time to me the Bible made sense.
Hmm.
It was like, oh wow. So I read that book all night long. It was like 375 pages. I read the whole thing. by sunup because I was hungry. I was like, I want to know what
Right.
is this whole thing about. And so that
Hmm.
was the gift that Tom gave me was he let me have his ear, and he gave me the 12th planet. So that kind of sparked a fire inside of me. And then by 1997, so this happened to me in 96. So the following year, towards the end of the next year, um, that's when I met Lloyd Pye because I actually had moved in with Tom and lived with him for a year or two, and uh, and so Lloyd was finishing the manuscript on his book and had called up Tom. And for some reason, Tom invited him down and said, "Why don't you give a presentation to the New Age bookstore down here?" Which he agreed to, thank God, because Tom says, I want you to meet Lloyd Pye. And I was like, okay. And so Lloyd rolls up, and he just came from New York from his publishers, and he had the manuscript to his book. And he did his very first public presentation, and I was there running the opaque projector. And I'm sitting there in the front row with this opaque projector, and that whole manuscript, we blew through that whole thing in 90 minutes.
Wow.
Every page of that book, and I just couldn't move fast enough. I'm just putting these papers in this projector like as fast as I can go. And when he rolls through the whole theory of the hominoids is the way he sees it, it just clicked. I was like, oh my God, this is it. And this is what I want to do too. And so I was super inspired, and I'm just like, okay, I got to get up to the Pacific Northwest where the energy is more acceptable, because I couldn't talk to anybody,
Right.
that I was living with, or around, much less, they just didn't, not in Florida.
They just viewed it through a religious perspective, or at least some of them did. And
Right.
Sasquatch didn't fit with that.
Not at all. Not at all. So, yeah. So
Now
by
this,
1999, I was able to finally make it up here, up to the
yeah,
Bellingham area. So that's when I finally moved. And so, I was just dipping my toe in the water. I literally moved up here in a backpack. I didn't know anybody. And within within 2 years of moving here, I was in a relationship with a woman that we got pregnant. We had a son in 2001, and then fast forward, it's like I was going out doing research. I was going to conferences. I went to the 19. I did go to Stephen Harvey's conference in Vancouver, British Columbia, in 1999, towards the end of the year, and I got to meet Grover Krantz, which was
hmm
it was really interesting because we were in a roundtable discussion on a Monday, and I am I have no idea who these guys are. John Bindernagel was there, Thomas
been
Steenberg,
yeah, yeah,
Bindernagel's there, and Krantz. I don't know these guys. I have no idea
hmm
who's who. Never met them, never seen pictures of them. But I was just really happy to be there because I told Steven on the phone, it's like, hey, I saw that you have a conference there, and I missed Saturday and Sunday, and you're having like a small gathering on Monday, and it was just the hardcore people, like the PhDs. And even Steenberg was there, and Bill Miller, who is an expert on the Zapruder film and the Patterson film. And so I had these four guys in the room with me, and Steven's like, and I'm like this guest of honor, and I roll into this meeting, and they put me at the end of this conference table, and so I'm telling my story like I am here, and it was really interesting because Grover was sitting right across from me, and he pulls his glasses off like this, and he goes, "Young man, you have the most
Huh,
believable eyewitness account story of
really.
anybody I've had the pleasure of interviewing." Which I took offense to because I heard the word story, and I
Oh,
said, I said,
story.
I said, dude, this was not. I'm not making up stories. He goes, no, 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 no,
Uh-huh.
no, no, no. I believe what you're saying. I can tell that what you're telling is true.
Hmm.
And I said, oh, okay. And John Bindernagel was just there, just taking notes as fast as I thought his notebook was going to catch fire. And because that's the way John is, he just was.
Yeah.
Grover was taking notes too, but yeah, it was real.
Share, for those people who don't know who Grover Krantz was, share who that is.
Yeah,
And then I've got a story about John Binnenagel too.
yeah,
Go
yeah.
ahead.
Grover Krantz was responsible for the jawbone of Gigantopithecus. He was the one that figured out, shaped the skull and said, okay, if you have a jawbone like this, the rest of the skull is probably going to look like this. So, he's in the history books. And he's in the Sasquatch history books too, because the Bossberg cripple, he examined that track,
Uh,
so yeah, Grover did a lot of he did a lot of research on casts, and offered a lot of good critique, and gave us a deeper understanding of the kinematics and morphology of the foot, you know, with Meldrum, they worked.
I went with the BFRO to on one of their expeditions up to Vancouver Island, and we went to Strathcona. I think that's what it's called, the provincial park, and that's where I met John Bindernagel, and he
Yeah.
gave me one of his casts, and he was just a great guy. So
Oh, he's a
there's
great
some
guy.
very interesting
Yeah.
personalities
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
are
John was
involved in
gold.
this.
Yep.
Keep going.
Yeah. So, yeah, I was really fortunate to just land right into that group of people. And then Bill Miller and I became really good friends. And, he bought a Polaris Ranger, and I've got to go out with him a couple times at Sasquatch Provincial Park in Harrison Hot Springs, and go to the different spots where there had been sightings. And, visited with John Bindernagel a lot, because he would come to Bellingham all the time, because I think it was his daughter that lived there. So
Oh,
we'd always catch each other in Costco. It was kind of funny.
cool.
And, Thomas Steenberg too. He wrote the book In Search of Giants, and I think maybe another book. So
Uh, so
seen Tom
so
several
talk.
times.
Talk about this conference because I think this
Yeah,
is the conference I went to
yeah,
and
yeah. You
made
sure
me
did.
first thought of you.
Yeah. So in 2005, I just felt like this. Honestly, I wanted to put this conference together to introduce the entire community to Lloyd Pye's work, because that's the way I was introduced to it. It was like I had my sighting, and I'm trying to think of, why is this important? Why is the topic of Sasquatch important? Well, I mean, the thing about the 12th planet with Sitchin's work is that in a nutshell, it basically said that there was an advanced civilization that came to Earth, like a long time ago, 250 to 300,000 years ago, and took the existing hominoids and bound their DNA to it to create humans, which made a lot of sense to me at the time. It's like I just thought, if we're going to get behind a worldview that would have a lot of traction, this made a lot of sense to me, and I could
Uh,
go there because I didn't quite really buy evolution or creationism. I was kind of like, I was just on the fence. It seems like there's evidence on both sides, but there's really, I mean, how much proof is required to really make something solid, and that was the question I had. I was like, I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. And so it was fascinating to me that we had 6,000-year-old tablets that talked about these creatures, and it
yeah,
was like,
very
okay,
fascinating.
I think we
Very
should pay
fascinating.
attention to that, so
Uh,
that was my whole point of, bringing up this conference. So you can see the name list in the right hand column. It's like I was able to get all these people to come here, and it was a really fantastic conference. I think it was one of those conferences that really changed the course of how things happened from that point forward with conferences. And so, yeah, I felt really blessed and lucky that I was able to put that together. And so yeah, and as far as like doing research and stuff like that, I most of my really hardcore research happened right like between 1999 and 2000. I did a little bit of research after 2005, like 2006, and then my partner Star passed away
uh,
in 2006, so I kind of just cooled down on it for like four
uh,
years, and then I didn't really get back into it till like 2010 with William Barnes and the Falcon Project, which I'll get into.
yeah, and I want to be sensitive to time here too, your time. So, um, just keep going.
Yeah. So yeah, this quote, I really like this quote, because to me, if there's a mythology circulating amongst a tribe of people, I think it's really important to pay attention to it, because it's not that the myth is something that we should believe at face value, even though at many times that's the case. Um, but there's always a reason why we see these tribes from all over the world that have a name for these creatures. So this mythology has been circulating for centuries, and this is like another Paul. That's Paul Smith in the background there. But I just love his artwork. I thought he did a fantastic job on it,
I would
and
agree.
I think we need to keep in mind, it's like when we talk about, the scientific approach. The scientific approach pretty much negates most of the paranormal aspects of this field, but we have to remember that it's a long progression of corrected mistakes. They're always changing their mind. Give it some years, and people are going to switch their beliefs. I know I have.
So let's talk a little bit about that because that's interesting to me. Um, who was it? Might have been David Paulides, if
Hmm.
you're familiar with him.
Yeah, 411. Yeah.
Yeah, that he's been a Bigfoot researcher, and at one point in time, I think I heard some kind of discussion involving him where he was told he was threatened essentially that if he talked about Bigfoot in any kind of supernatural or paranormal way, that that was totally unacceptable. So you might address how you feel about that, this kind of
Yeah.
paranormal aspect
Yeah.
of Sasquatch.
Yeah. I feel like you can't throw out the baby with the bathwater. There's too many people experiencing paranormal aspects to this phenomenon that it would be, I mean, to me, it would be stupid to negate it. Uh, it just doesn't make sense to me. It's just evidence. It's not proof, it's just evidence. We have an evidential experience of people having telepathy, of seeing them go in portals. Uh,
Hmm.
I've interviewed lots of people who are super conservative people that see UFOs and Sasquatch in the same night,
Yeah,
and they
I,
are struggling. They're like, "What do I do with that?"
uh-huh,
And it's
exactly.
just, and you just get all this stuff that you just don't. It's just not. You can't package it up nice and neat. You just can't. It's a mess. This whole field is a
Differentiate,
mess.
Jason, differentiate between proof and evidence. What's your
Yeah,
distinction with that?
yeah. What I like to say is that evidence doesn't mean that it's true. It means that when you, like for instance, if you're out in the forest and you see a track, well, that's evidence of Bigfoot, but it's not necessarily proof.
Proof, okay.
Especially if it's been pressed down into a bunch of cedar duff, which I've seen before. And I put my boot, and I got a Bigfoot. I have a size 16 shoe, and I had 2 inches in the front and 2 inches in the back. It was an 18-inch track. And but what I can't use that evidence and say that it's proof in most people's eyes. Proof requires it to be probably statistically appearing so often that it just cannot be refuted anymore. And
And then
that's,
is it something that can be replicated too? Is
yeah,
that
I mean,
a
yeah,
differentiation between
yeah,
proof and evidence?
evidence can become proof when when it's demonstrated repeatedly, and that's the
Okay.
scientific method. But
Yeah.
it goes back to what that quote that myths don't point to facts because myths are evidence. It points to something that informs the fact. Well, if you see tracks all over a place, well, there's probably Bigfoot in that area, and so you just keep looking until you can establish it concrete. And so there's lots of evidence for lots of different aspects in this field. I personally did an interview with two different wildlife biologists that said that this creature was talking to them in their minds.
Mm.
And they kept on leaning over the table. We were like at a coffee shop, and they're like, "I know you're going to think I'm crazy, but I swear to God this happened." And I said, "Please don't think that I think you're crazy. You're fine. I've been through this before, and this is happening with a level of frequency that I feel that we need to pay attention to this data because there's something about it. Because other things happen, like people, like one guy was hunting, and he had a rifle, and he was looking through a scope, and it was like the thing could feel him looking at the back of its head, and it
Mm.
turned around and it looked right in his direction, and he was up the mountain in camouflage behind bushes, and it felt him. These things
Wow.
have an extraordinary sixth sense, seventh sense, I don't know. And another thing too, like the eye shine. A lot of people think, oh, it's just eye shine. Well, I've seen the eye shine in the dead of dark when there was no flashlights, and that's disturbing because it's like, well, what is that? How come their eyes glow red? That's evidence. Okay, I had evidence of seeing this, and when I talked to Doug Hychek, who did Sasquatch Legend Meets Science, he was the producer.
Right. right.
You know, Doug said, "Oh, you've seen that? I've seen that too." And he was like the only other person I knew of that seen it
Mm,
in the upper province of I think it was Manitoba. He was up there years ago, and they would see it on night hikes, in the dead of night. And he did some research on it and found out that none of the apes, none of the apes alive today, no matter how big or small, they don't do that. They don't have bioluminescent cells in their eyes, but humans do.
mm.
And he told me that on the phone. He says, "Isn't that interesting? What do you think about that?" And all I could think about was Sitchin. It's like, wow, the Sumerian texts tell us that humans are a hybrid between the like Homo erectus and whatever this advanced civilization is. So humans have 2 to 4 bioluminescent cells per eyeball. That's weird. So it's like I always take those things and file them into the back of my mind for a later date because it's probably going to come up again.
Dave, Jinks is having trouble getting into the Zoom, but he has a question for you. So I'm going to see if I can
Yeah,
get
guys,
that
can you hear
question.
me?
Oh, there
There
you
you
are.
are.
You can.
Yeah.
Okay, hi, Jason. Good to
Hey,
meet
Dave.
you.
Nice
I'm
to meet
Dave. I have been here the whole time,
Oh,
listening with rapt attention here. I didn't try to break in because you're on such a roll there, Jason. But you made me think of something here that I just had to tune in and ask you. You mentioned the sixth or seventh sense that these creatures, these people maybe is a more respectful term, they
you.
appear to have. And
mhm.
I'm wondering, clearly you have a background in evolution and all things scientific, as far as I can tell. It's been very impressive so far. But what's your feeling on the idea that um, the Sasquatch have developed or evolved that kind of sense, much in the way that the bat, has sonar or uses different fish use, different ways to interpret electromagnetic radiation, and they navigate, birds navigate, so on. What do you think about the idea that Sasquatch has just developed this over the eons, what we would call a sixth sense, but maybe it's just a natural, accumulation of certain type of sense that humans don't have anymore, if we ever did. Do you think that makes sense?
Oh, sure. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think in a microevolutionary way, I think I mean, when we think about the environment that these creatures live in, naked, and how they're equipped, like the adipose tissue that they have, their hair, um, everything about them biologically gives them the capacity to live in incredibly harsh environments.
Hmm.
And and especially when I think about 12,000 years ago, if you really think about 12,000 years ago, the megafauna that roamed this continent, the size of the cats, and there were these dog creatures that were huge, and then the bears, like the short-faced bear, that was even bigger than the grizzlies of today. There was some really mean, nasty animals that were all over the place. And if you're an upright walking um, hominid, hominoid, whatever you want to call it, you better be equipped with some sixth sense, seven senses if you're going to
Right.
survive. It's
To
like,
survive, right.
yeah, I mean, like I look at these pictures of evolutionary biologists trying to depict what they call the prehumans, which are basically the Sasquatch, in these very slender, under-muscled bodies, almost anorexic looking. There's no way they look like that. They were robust. Their bones were like crystals. They could take an enormous amount of torque. Um, the night vision alone, when you think about being able to have the sclera in your eyeballs broadcast infrared light so that the whatever's inside of your iris, that's probably a more sophisticated technology than rods and cones, could literally see in the black of night with no light at all. Holy shit, that's some sophisticated technology. So
Mhm.
why wouldn't there be this? Well, let's talk about the pineal gland. maybe their pineal gland is completely evolved. You know, they might telepathically uh, talk with each other, and those of us who are sensitive enough get to peer into that little window a little bit. You know, through some of these
Mhm.
eyewitness accounts that people have had with telepathic experiences. I've interviewed them, and I'm like, well,
Yeah,
it's happening.
and
It's happening too much to deny it. You know,
it really does. You, of course, touched on skeptical viewpoints, and um, it really does kind of play into our position because we agree with you on your conclusions here. I'm sure Dan would say that's definitely the case. Uh, when you make that point that you just did, is that if these creatures, if these people, these hominids have been in this arena, harshest conditions you can imagine, um, those are expected abilities. It's
right?
not like we no longer have to ascribe them to magical abilities. Uh, that's what you would expect one of these animals or hominids to develop over time. So the evolutionary card can't be played against this argument that we make all the time. And then you throw in all the other again, you touched on some of the work of uh, the the how the animals move, how they're built differently, structured differently. You throw in all that structural stuff as well as the evidence for the evolutionary changes that make sense, and there's not a whole lot left to be able to dismiss this area of study as paranormal until, and where I'm going with this is that until you throw in some of the very strange stuff that we see Bigfoot sometimes associated with, and you
Right.
mentioned it also, a UFO experience or
Mhm.
other paranormal experiences. I'm wondering maybe you're getting that to that in your presentation here. I don't want to cut that off if that's where you're going, but I know that Dan has always been very interested in that aspect too, and I resisted that for a long time, as many people who get involved in this do. I thought it was just an advanced ape. But then Dan says, but what about these cases where
Yeah.
there was
Yep.
one footprint and the thing disappeared into the ether
Right.
or whatever, or they came off of a UFO, or they were related to, a
Mhm.
UFO sighting.
Right.
So can you, again, if you're getting to that, don't let me push you there. I know we're kind of pushing up on an hour here too. We want to respect your time, but uh, where does that all fit in your mind after you've looked at this for many years, decades?
Well, it definitely fits in. I mean, it like you, it took me time to adjust to this because everything about my eyewitness account was very physical. There wasn't really anything paranormal about it. It was like, oh shit, she just got caught. She looks surprised, and she did a remarkable feat of physical capabilities that was like, holy shit, this thing jumped 30 feet from a standing position, twisting 90 degrees to her left. That's pretty badass strength. You know, it's like, what can do that? And so everything about it was physical. And so it took me time to be able to adjust. You know, like when I moved up the Pacific Northwest, and I started meeting people that were sharing with me, elements. Like perfect example, I was at another perfect example besides the two wildlife biologists that were telling me about the telepathic communication. I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Tom Powell wrote The Locals.
Yeah, in
Yeah,
down Oregon.
I love Tom. We were at a get together down in, I don't know if we were in Oregon or Southern Washington. Can't remember where. We were at a campground, and this guy Larry comes rolling in, and found out about the gathering and was like, "I really need somebody to talk to. I just had something happen to me." So Tom looks at me because he knew I was into the sitch and stuff. So that was enough outside of the box for him to include me in on this conversation. So Tom and this guy Larry and his wife, the four of us pair off from the rest of everybody else because everybody was so biological. It's just an ape. That's it, you
Mhm.
know. and I was pretty open-minded. And so Larry starts to tell this whole story about him being in the Blue Mountains in Oregon, and all of a sudden he walks through a portal,
Hmm.
and I'm just sitting there like, what? Holy
What? Yeah.
shit! What am I listening to? And he was sincere. I mean, he was on the verge of tears, you know. And 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 this keeps coming up. There's like all kinds of things that just keep on coming up with these paranormal aspects, and you can't dismiss them. We got to deal with them at some point. So let's just deal with them now and at least acknowledge, okay, this did happen to this guy, and it just seems like you can put a lie detector on this guy, and he believes that he experienced this, and I know
Hmm.
what that feels like because I've had people tell me that. I've
Hmm.
told my story to plenty of people that looked at me dead in the face and said, "Well, I can't believe in Sasquatch, but I definitely believe that you believe that Sasquatch is real." You know, okay, well, I guess I did my job. You know, I'm trying to report my eyewitness account as accurate as I can. And most people that have heard me tell the story over and over say, yeah, you felt the same way pretty much every single time. I don't conflate anything. And if I remember uh, if I have like a new angle on what I remember from what I experienced, then I say that that's what it is.
One thing I wondered about, and this is in reference to a mutual friend of Jason and mine, Sherry Mulholland, who used to live in the Bellingham area and was interested in Sasquatch. Sherry has told me, and I've never been with her when she's seen it, she's had three different encounters with Sasquatch, and they just happened incidentally. One day she was walking from her office. She was a substance abuse counselor for the Lummi tribe. She was walking out to her car, and Sasquatch is standing out by her car. And she had two other kind of incidents. I've spent, I don't know how long, when I lived in Bellingham, I spent, I don't know how long out in the woods looking for Sasquatch. Nothing. So I've kind of wondered if Sasquatch taps into certain people under certain circumstances. And I don't know if that's the paranormal aspect or not. Do you have a perspective on that, Jason?
Oh, for sure. Yeah. I mean, I've had the same experience. Like my friend John Andrews, who was at the conference. Him and Daryl and Doug and Richard and Nancy. Nancy didn't come to the conference, but there's some people that seem to be magnets.
Hmm.
Daryl and Doug were definitely like that. Um, John went with Nancy, Daryl's mother, and they captured those recordings up at just outside of Gold Bar, Washington. And I love playing those because he sent that whole reel to NIDS, National Institute of Discovery Sciences,
Yeah, right.
and they did that analysis of that audio. They said, whatever this thing is, it has lungs way bigger than a human by far, and a
Wow.
vocal tract that can create several harmonics at the same time. So we know it's not a human.
Yeah, interesting. Well, unfortunately, I'm bumping up against another obligation that I've got to go to. Dave, do you have any final thoughts, comments for Jason?
Well, I mean, we could probably go for hours more.
Oh,
Hopefully,
sure.
we can get a part two or three, going with
Absolutely.
Jason because he really clearly knows his stuff. I just want to get a quick take on Jason, on your view of what best constitutes evidence here in terms of getting more people to just pay attention to this. I mean, unfortunately and fortunately, we're in the age of AI where the unfortunate part is I don't think you can ever trust a piece of
Yeah.
video evidence or image evidence
Yeah.
again. And I
Yep.
haven't trusted one since the mid 90s, I think, because people
Right.
can fake stuff and they can do it
Yep.
pretty
It's
darn
true.
well. We
Yeah, it's
got the
true.
Patterson Gimlin. Luckily, that film to me stands as the most significant piece of evidence. It's been analyzed extensively by experts. It stood the test of time, in my opinion, but now the internet is flooded, YouTube is flooded with all sorts of Bigfoot videos. I was looking at the so-called Independence Day one earlier today
Hmm.
in preparation
Yeah.
for this interview, and it
Yep.
appears to be a mother with her baby.
Hmm.
But it's just I don't know what to think anymore. And
Right.
my question to you then is, how do you think we achieve some sort of critical mass where Bigfoot, Sasquatch becomes a legitimate area of study, or even more importantly, an area of lawmaking, perhaps,
Hmm.
protect them as
Yeah,
a, individual species, or,
yeah,
in their territories, whatever. What needs to happen in order for people to realize that this is an important thing and we need to, study, learn
sure,
about?
yeah, sure, absolutely. Well, I think that there's several components to the whole phenomenon that are important. I think the paranormal can be just as important as what we call the science part of it. And
Right.
the slide I have up right now shows skulls. And when you skin these creatures' skulls, and some of the, we have some of the skeletons, some of the hands and feet, and when you look at that to me is where it turns from evidence to proof. We have proof that these things did exist. The question is, did they go extinct? Well, according to the science of statistics, like Dr. Henner Fehrenbach talked about this, with the frequency of sightings that have happened, just the sheer number of people that have come forward worldwide and have talked about, yeah, I had this experience, I saw this thing and it looked like this is the way I described it. There is a there's a generator function that points to the fact, okay, these have to be real, these have to be alive today. So the question is, how does evolution work? How does the family tree split? You know, is evolution really real? You know, and I'm still out on the jury on that one. I don't know, but I know that there's enough questions that have led to more questions, and that we can't stop asking them. We have to keep on looking at this through the lens of science, because we do have their bones, and since we have their bones, we have to keep on looking at it. Okay, well, if people are still seeing them, then we do have to protect them. We do. And as
Mhm.
far as the paranormal aspects of it, that is to me just as important, because there is a message in there. There is a thread that is so critically important, probably to how we relate to life, our own existence, that we need to pay attention to, because there is a relationship. It is weird that humans have 46 chromosomes, and everything, including the prehumans, as far as we know, we have every reason to believe that anything that would resemble a Sasquatch probably has 46 chromosomes. But why did we lose two? And why do we share some of their traits? So those are all things that, to me, they became incredibly important to me. And all I can really do is say, well, based on my experience growing up religious, it freed me from being inside of a box. Seeing this Sasquatch took me outside of a box, and it set me outside.
Mhm. Something else took him out of the box, apparently.
Yeah, it's not like there's a
Have we lost
issue.
you, Jason?
Yeah, maybe.
Well,
Well,
Dan, that may be the end of our interview
yeah,
today.
that might
Yeah,
be anyway.
yeah.
Oh,
Uh,
no,
uh, Oh, so you
he's back.
froze up there, Jason.
What's that?
You froze up there for
Oh,
a
I
while.
did. Oh, sorry.
Yeah. No, not
What
your
was my what
fault.
was my
The
last
techno.
word?
We're talking about. Well, I can't remember now
Okay.
exactly what we're
It
talking
was
about.
it was a good 10 seconds or so.
Yeah,
Oh, okay.
So
yeah.
you dropped out. But anyway, that we understand the point that you're making. And I would love to hear, you mentioned Zecharia Sitchin, and some of those theories. That model was ridiculed endlessly
Yeah.
decades ago,
Yep.
but now it's not looking so crazy in a lot of ways.
Mhm.
Exactly. Exactly.
And I would love to see a complete history of the human race. And were we manipulated at some point? Were we imported from somewhere else, say
Right.
Mars? Or, I mean, I think our history is so much richer and even more unbelievable than the most creative sci-fi we can come up with. And
Yeah.
gosh, I sure hope that we get to see a complete narrative of what has happened. I don't know how you ever reach that, but you got to, go one puzzle piece at a time. And Sasquatch is definitely a big
It's
one
a
of
big
those
part of it.
pieces, in my opinion. And it sounds like
Absolutely.
Jason's on board with
Yep.
that idea.
Yep.
Well, Jason, I'd like to thank you for coming on with us again. I think this is the second or third time, if you count that cryptozoology
Yeah,
class that we
yeah, it's
did
only the
with.
third time.
But please come back
Yeah,
again.
let's do it again.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
I'm thinking that this discussion could go on. But thanks for being with us. And
My
once
pleasure.
Dave gets this edited, we'll send you a copy of it, and you could post it anywhere you want to.
Sounds good.
Okay.
Yes.
All
Thank you,
right.
Jason. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks, David.
All right. Yeah.
Okay.
Bye-bye, guys.
All right. Bye-bye.
Gonna
Have a good
end the
night.
meeting.
Occam's razor. There we go. Good thing to end on. Thanks, Jason.
Thank you.
Bye.